So before we get started talking about Fidelio, I want to ask you about something that one of the leaders of a major opera company in this country said um, in response to a panel that Janae Bridges held, examining race and the issues of race in the arts from the perspective of Black artists. And the response that this leader gave, and I'm specifically being vague, was horror and sorrow that the lived experience of those artists went unheard in that raw way. How could this or any other executive in the performing arts not be more fundamentally aware of the systemic problems that exist in the arts?
I think it's just that it's systemic. There is a systematic ignorance of the experiences of those who are not able-bodied, white, older, privileged. And so it's a shame, but the system allows us to continue on with our art making without considering all the different perspectives and experiences that exist in society, which is really a shame. And in my, part of my activism, as I imagine is really trying to pull us back to what opera used to be, which was, disruptive. It was meant to represent the people. People were in the 1830s and 40s screaming "Viva Verdi," in the streets of Italy, because that's how on the pulse this art form was. And now it has become this exclusive thing, or it's trying to become. But folks like me are rebelling against that trend. But I think you make a really good point in that one can say something like that and feel like they're being profound. But instead, it really just speaks to the decades of our inability to truly represent everyone in this art form.
Well, it is kind of crazy. I think we learned this week that those problems aren't just in the performing arts world, they're in the sports world, they're everywhere.
Yep.
And it's
although opera, I would say opera is at the very tip in terms of just how bad it is, even in terms of the scholarship alone of EDI, what inclusion means, all of these things. It has been really surprising and scary how far we have to go. The smartest people, most innovative folks we have in our industry don't even understand this work. They understand how to provoke with a 2022 version of La Boheme, but not necessarily when it comes to better representing those of us who live in society.
Right, and how much of that is a concern about a season ticket holder base that is predominantly older and white.
Right.
I don't know whether it's placating to a base, which God knows a lot of people do in this country, or whether it's actual genuine, I don't know, naivete, because I think that comment was rather naive in extreme.
Yeah. I honestly feel like it's a little bit of both, but the more troubling, I would say, is the former, because how could you possibly expect to expand your base if you're only going to continue to placate the base you have? You must first make the decision and make the determination that, okay, the folks I see coming to all of my operas, all of my concerts, all of my donor events look one certain way, and this is a problem, and that's the thing for folks like me that is really problematic, is that these people weave in EDI work and anti-racism and inclusion into their mission statements and their values, and they plaster on their websites, and yet they can go to a concert where there's literally no BIPOC folks, or literally, no one group, and it doesn't trouble them. I've gotten to the point where I go to performances now. I went to the New York Field a couple nights ago, and I was physically uncomfortable with how white it is, as delicious as they sound. I was like, and they're playing like Julius Eastman to end their concert, and I'm like sitting there like, how are you all getting away with being this white in 2022 in New York City? And it doesn't alarm us as much as it should. And I'm sure there are efforts being done. I'm sure if I were to go on the New York Field website, I could find, some statements and some really high profile people helping them with this work. And yet what I see as a concert goer is one Black face of this entire international orchestra. And so it just continues to ingrain within all of us that that's okay, because that's what we continue to see, even as these more provocative, more in-depth conversations are being had about inclusion.
Well, it's interesting because in doing some research for a previous interview, I came across an essay that George Walker wrote and had published in the New York Times in November of 1991 called Make Room for Black Classical Music. Now we're talking almost 32 years ago. And it seems like that essay is just as relevant today as it was 3 decades ago. Do you think what the progress, and I'll use the term in quotes, of the last 2 or 3 years is going to realize true results? Or is this the same kind of tokenism that Walker bemoaned in his column 32 years ago?
Yeah, I'm going to answer your question in 2 ways, because I think it's definitely the same tokenism. Because those who are aligned with the system, they don't know how to do anything else. When they hear, you want more diversity? Okay, let me grab some Black people, some Asian people, some Hispanic folks, and somehow layer them into my business plan. I'm not going to learn about what they want or about their experience, about how to authentically represent them on stage. But you want diversity, so I'm going to show you some different colors. And I'm going to force them into white supremacist structures, those that don't consider their own experiences, ways in which they may differ from the ways we have done things for decades in these art forms. But we're going to put them on stage, we're going to throw them behind desks. And then when things stop working well for them, because this system has really been built against them, we'll just throw them out as opposed to restructuring it anyway. So that part, that's tokenization at its core. But what I would say now, and what I hope is the conversation that I hope is changing in activism space, is that instead of, as George Walker, and I love George Walker, said, make room for Black musicians or Black music and in the classical space, now it's about demanding the Black space. I wrote an essay recently, or I wrote it as an essay, but I presented it as a seminar for the International Contemporary Ensemble called Poems Are Bullshit, Demanding Black Space in Opera, because I really think it has come to a point where we are the people who understand the types of changes that need to be made, and yet we don't have the agency to make those changes. And so somehow we have to snatch power as best we can. And I use spaces like this, these last several summers, for example, where Black Lives Matter has been more prominent with the murder of George Floyd, where companies are becoming more in tune with the public cry for better inclusion, better equity, and use those moments to actually implement as much change as I can. And then once we get out of those phases for large society, I've still built some structures that I can rely on to keep moving forward, and I think that's the level of strategy we have to have, because what these decades since, 31 years ago, as you said, from Mr. Walker's statement, clearly those who have historically held power are not willing to change, because whether it's conscious or subconscious, there is a deliciousness behind that power. There's an alluring nature to it. And so no matter how well they talk about these other topics and inclusion, there's something inherently that works against it. I'm even to the point where I feel folks are learning how to talk about inclusion, equity, diversity, anti-racism, and accessibility in these sort of intellectual ways as part of their packaging. It's become branding. It's become, are you the most woke general director in 2022? Because you can talk about these things, but are you actually implementing those things in your organization, making systematic change around inclusion, systematic change around accessibility? And I think that's where we'll find that most general directors in opera fall short.
It's interesting. As you're saying that, I'm thinking of the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I sort of feel like there needs to be the cultural equivalent of that at
Yep.
this point.
Yep. Yeah, and that really is the key. That really is the key, this idea of anti-racism, and it has existed forever. But we're calling it anti-racism, and it's that difference between someone just sort of flippantly saying, "Oh, I'm not racist," or "I have Black friends," or "I have this," or "I have this," or "I'm married to a Black person." All of these things as if that's what it means to not be racist in a systematically racist system. You know what I mean? Society. You're like, in order to not be racist, you have to work against it. That's how you can work towards being not racist. It's almost like justice. I always tell folks in my consulting, do I imagine I'm ever going to see true justice in my lifetime? Of course not. We're too far from it. But the only way I can feel secure in my values is if every single day of my life I'm working towards it. And that's what anti-racism entails. It's this acceptance, this acknowledgement that we don't currently have the agency to completely reverse decades, centuries of racism. But what we do have the agency to do is to actively work against the structures every single day, pull it into every single activity we have as human beings. And that's what it means to be an anti-racist. And I really wish more folks will hop on that train. I wish that would become the cool woke thing to do, and how to do it, even if it's not fueled by the same values as mine. If you're working in that same space as me, I can be down for it.
Right. Well, let's talk about another area that is systemically racist, and that's the prison industrial complex, which brings us to Fidelio. Rock is an interesting character, and I haven't seen the production yet. I plan to when it's out here. But you're depicting a character who is sort of a cog in this prison industrial complex that is inherently racist. Yep. And I'm wondering what the challenges are for you in this production so that we understand the humanity besides this man who's trapped in a situation that maybe is his only opportunity for employment.
Yeah, that's a really, really lovely question, because that is the core of my journey, my character journey, right? And I think, being able to see Rock in the beginning of the opera with his daughter, Marcy, in our version, and the way he jokes with her, and the laughing and the lightheartedness, and the true love that he has for her, and the love you can see building between him and in our version, Leah, or the original Eleonore, it paints him with humanity, so that by the time you get to truly understand how problematic he is in terms of all of the injustice that's happening within this this prison, you automatically have an internal conflict with how to view Rock. It's very, very difficult to view. I don't know if it's my interpretation or just the libretto we had, the new updated script we have. But I doubt anyone can come into the theater and say, "Oh my God, I hate that guy. He did this to Stan for all of these years, or for all of these months." And in our version, it's 11 months. But rather, man, like, how could that person, so full of love, so clearly intelligent when it comes to what's necessary, what are the necessary values to pass on to one's daughter, for example, how could that also be the same person who has not figured out a solution for this guy who's been disappeared in the basement of the prison system? And I think, we have some added dialogue that helps to clarify that, because I think characters like Rock absolutely exist in society. There are many Black folks, and I'm sure folks of other races and and experiences, who feel they must work within the system necessarily in order to retain whatever little power or authority they have to make changes in other areas. And usually it's within their immediate family. I'm always remembering this poem by Maya Angelou, called The Mask. and talking about how the mask, the laughing that so many Black folks throughout history have put on, even when they were enslaved, has gotten folks like me in 2022 the ability to be here and to feel more free than a person would have felt 100 years ago. And that's just this idea of I am doing this as a strategic move, as long as it's intentional, then even if it's problematic, it has some productivity. And that's really a nuanced perspective of any marginalized group that large society can never really understand. And that's why we kind of just have to trust people who are coming from these experiences that are so marginalized that it takes a nuanced perspective to really understand how to bring them into utility.
This opera was first performed, what, 4 years ago?
Yes, 2018.
Right. So how has your relationship to the work evolved as situations in this country in particular have changed over those 4 years?
Oh, I mean, tremendously. And strangely, actually, because when we did the opera the first time, I was just as loud about all the things I think need to change. But what was different about me 4 years ago is that my activism, my scholarship, my performance, all of these spaces, all of these hats that I wore were sort of different buckets of my life. And you know, 2018, a personal traumatic event happened in my life. And it just began this journey of understanding that activism, justice needs to sit at the center of everything I do, no matter what. There's no space to like, oh, well, now I'm just a classical opera singer, so I have to just do these things this way. And then once I clock out for the day, I can go back to the street and protest or something. It's like no, it needs to sit everywhere. Similar to what I was saying about anti-racism, it needs to be layered into everything that I do. And so now coming into this work is not only about how I'm interpreting the character of Rock, it's also about how we're rehearsing. It's about the conversations we're having with Ethan, the director, or Dan, the music director, about the musicality of the piece or the different language that is used in the book scenes. It's the values we're bringing into our rehearsal process, making sure that our rehearsal process itself is not steeped in a white supremacist structure, which a lot of rehearsal processes in classical music are. And so trying to dismantle all around the production, not just within one narrow lane of character interpretation. That for me is the biggest change.
Daniel told the New York Times that the fact that the opera went through so many changes, it sort of gave him license to make other changes, that the opera could withstand different interpretations. If you had a chance, this is a weird hypothetical, if you had a chance to discuss with Beethoven what this Fidelio is and why this Fidelio is, what would you say to him and what would you hope or think his response might be?
Mm. I really think the major thrust of that conversation would be something along the lines of thank you, and this is how it can be used in this context. And it would be a conversation around inviting him, if he didn't just automatically do this. He's a great artist, so maybe this would be his first approach anyway, but inviting him to release some of the power of the beauty and artistry that he's poured into this score into a different conversation, understanding that the kind of conversation he was having, the topics are still there, but it's needed in a slightly different space about which you might not have all of the perspective. And so I would invite him to just let us take over some of that authority to determine what's going to be the most fruitful in terms of interpretation, in terms of changes. And I feel artist to artist, and really you know, I don't know if Beethoven want me to call him an activist, but he certainly was someone who had his set of values about where music should go and what his place in music would be, and just, you know, drove it through all that he did. That's activism to me. And so, artist to artist or activist to activist, I think his response would be okay. And I hope his response would be, you know, let me know how I can help. So, yeah, like that I see you using two horns now only. Like this harmony on page 79 might work a little better if you just, you know, instead of a fully diminished chord, you know, whatever. He's Beethoven, so I'm sure he would have some comments about how to make his score work better. But I hope overall it would be a thank you from me and a well done from him.
Well, it's interesting. The reason I ask is last year when the video went out, I interviewed Michael Black Powell, who was one of the performers in the Coogie's Men's Chorus. And the one thing he told me is I never thought that Beethoven, you know, that he and Beethoven would identify somewhere and be on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
You know, that Beethoven understood back then the same conflicts and challenges that he as an incarcerated man was having prior to his, well, he had been out for a year by the time I spoke to him.
Yeah.
What do you think this opera in particular, particularly for people who don't think opera is for them, what do you think this opera and this production has to say that might convince them, you know, it isn't just a relic of the past. This is still as important today as it was in 1804.
Yeah, you know, I think you have exactly the right point of departure and statements like Michael's, and that, you know, what we have done is we've updated the dialogue and updated the story so it's so specifically relevant and today, you know, he's staying as a Black Lives Matter activist. And so it gives modern audiences, both those who are frequent opera goers, an opportunity to reimagine what this score can do, but also folks who've never been to an opera, because the book scenes alone give you the story, and then to put you into that world and to see how Beethoven's music sort of emphasizes, takes to the next level, these expressions of joy, these expressions of conflict, these expressions of agony. You know, that is the power of music, whether it's classical music, whether it's, you know, pop music at its very best. And so that sort of melding of this form in classical opera, you know, romantic opera specifically, the very beginning of romantic opera, and relevance. That's the thing. That's the thing about inclusion that we always miss, is relevance. You cannot, there is not an inherent gorgeousness to classical music itself. We find it gorgeous because we find ourselves represented in it. And so if we have not been successful at making it relevant for everybody, it makes sense, absolutely, that not everyone is going to find it interesting. And let alone, you know, beautiful or insightful or powerful or compelling or impactful, right? And so our sort of mixing of these two worlds is what I think brings relevance to everyone, and not only folks who are formerly incarcerated or Black folks, but everyone, because the prison industrial complex and the monumental stain it leaves on our society every single day we fail to figure out a solution for it. That's a problem of all of ours, whether we, you know, some of us are more or have closer proximity to it, others are farther away, but we're all a part of this society and it's affecting all of us. And so that's what makes this particular interpretation of the Beethoven score so relevant, I think.
And then for those who don't like opera, the fact that it's truncated to 90 minutes should certainly help their attention.
Oh, for sure. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I sat through a 4-hour Philip Glass opera without an intermission. So, you know.
Oh my, without an intermission, how is that? Who did that?
That was it was Einstein on the Beach. It was meant to be performed 4 hours straight through.
Man.
You could come and go as you wished, but I stopped drinking fluids 3 hours before the opera and took advantage of it as soon as it was over.
Wow.
That's sort of how you do that. But 90 minutes is good for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
guess.
And it's a packed 90 minutes. It's a very exciting, roller coaster of 90 minutes, which is great. That's what we all like.
Right. Now, the beauty of my job is that I get to speak to people like you and artists of through multiple areas of the performing arts. And one of my favorite conversations I had was 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, with jazz musician Charles Lloyd.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me, I thought I could change the world with my creativity. I'm naive enough to think that. Do you think that you can change the world with your creativity?
I was afraid you're about to say that he had since determined that he could not, because I will tell you, since I was a child, and this is not me, trying to be like provocative or, epiphany or anything like that. Since I was a child, I would wake up sometimes and feel such a creative, artistic energy in me. I would think, if I thought long enough about anything, any problem, I could figure out a solution. And as life has gone on, of course, I've come to realize the many, many, many barriers that work against that type of thinking. Not only being, a Black man in society, or being young, or being whatever, being gay, but just in general, like there's several pegs of society in place systematically, structurally, that will work against you if you try to change them at their core. But I really do believe that. I really do believe that if I ever were to be given the right, I wouldn't say amount, but the right combination of space, of access, and authority, that my creativity could lead to, I wouldn't say every single solution, but many solutions. Because for me, and I think this is true for a lot of artists, you can see a problem, you can see an issue, you can see an injustice, a void of love, a void of light, and you feel a response to it naturally, artistically, from your soul. And I think what a lot of us are able to do is to reflect on it. Like, I write a piece, I sing a tune, or I paint a picture. But imagine if we had even more agency to have that picture mean something societally, have that song mean something societally. I really do think that could change the world. I think about, the Negro spiritual, for example, and how, during the time of slavery, these were used to soothe the souls of these enslaved people. They were also used as codes to talk about route escape plans. They were used as the only space for church going for some. They were used in so many different ways. And I think about now how spirituals are used, and how in 2013 can go to Italy and perform for an audience of mostly non-English speaking folks, a spiritual, and move most of them to tears, because that song had been born out of such a specific, authentic, deep human experience, that whoever were to bear witness to it singing would feel moved by it. That is the power of art. And I think if we were all allowed to be on that train of authenticity, a lot more things would change, because we would be more closely connected with each other.
Well, which I would assume means that you took the responsibility of Quando Project O, very seriously for
Yes.
Long Beach Opera.
Yes.
I can't wait to see this as well. But what really intrigues me is the second half. It's what happens after we see the film.
Yes.
And of course, you don't know what that's going to be.
Right.
I certainly don't know, because I am not part of it. But for people who would read the description of, well, you're going to watch a 25-minute film, and then you're going to watch all kinds of responses to it that we don't know what they're going to be. Can you provide any more illumination or clarity about what this is?
Yeah, I mean, imagine a film, a beautiful film with its soundtrack, and then that exact same film again without the soundtrack, and with folks like the types of artists that I was just talking about, who see a problem, who see an issue, who see a lack, a void, and now I've curated the space for them to actually have the agency to do something about it immediately. And so everything you take for granted about these Verdian scores, I use La Traviata in Don Carlo, or the, the Gluck Euridice, they will disrupt and they will problematize. And to do so in real time after we've just enjoyed, imagine watching something and being moved by music, and then someone telling you as soon as you're done watching it that the way in which you heard a certain musical score was problematic or was exclusive. That is the kind of art that I want to explore. I feel like art, creative spaces should be spaces of exploration, of experimentation. I think we should try to disabuse ourselves with this idea that there are any geniuses. I mean, I'm sure there are genial people, but like geniuses to the point that one person has the ability to create something so magnificent that it is perfect. I think everything should be up for conversation, and we should just start to inherently do that in how we share our experiences, our lives, our artistry with each other. And that's really what Quando is meant to do, because we're creating this gorgeous movie. I just watched what my editor is calling the pre-rough cut. and it's beautiful. And so it's not like we're creating anything problematic or on purpose. Like what we're creating is beautiful, but we're creating it and immediately releasing it into the land of interrogation. And that in and of itself is an act of activism by my estimation.
Well, and you're also working with, James over at Long Beach Opera, who when I spoke to him, I described him as director/disruptor, which he loved.
Yeah.
And I think that we need people like that who are going to just say, no, the status quo is not the way everything has to be done.
Yeah. And I will say, just as it so happened in the trajectory of this project, James has not been available to work on it a ton, but in the beginning, he and I had definitely had some good conversations about what it can be. And we both definitely have ideas about how film can work in opera. So that's been great, but I wouldn't say he's still actively involved in the project at this point.
No, but I'm sure he'll throw his 2 cents in before.
I hope so. Yeah.
I want to ask you one more thing before I let you go, and it's about something that Beethoven said. He said, "I wish music to help with the burdens of life and to help you release your happiness to others." How does your participation in Fidelio help you release your happiness to others?
I think showing the nuances of Blackness, that is my favorite thing about our production. And it's so mind-blowing that it's within the frame of a Beethovenian opera. But because of the way the script has come together, you have this young woman, ambitious, lesbian, bubbly, and you have, another woman who is determined to save her husband and is part of an activist movement, a Black Lives Matter activist, an older Black guy who's just trying to do his best, but he's problematic. You have 4 different shades, even in our principal characters, of experiences of Blackness that I would say really exist. And I think providing an opportunity for folks to see how each of those spaces interact with the various situations of our opera, it brings me happiness, because one thing I always say, and I've been saying this from the very first lecture presentation I gave, lecture recital I would call them, is that the key to solving America's issues of racial inequity and injustice is rooted in communication. Because once you have communication, you have a shot at understanding and compassion and love. And I think these sorts of nuanced views into how marginalized groups are traversing a very problematic, very marginalized experience. it's communicative in just the right way, and to bring Beethoven's music into it, and these new book scenes, I think it's really powerful. And it was powerful 4 years ago. And I can tell you, as someone who was a part of that production as well, this is even more powerful, because we've all, those of us who are returning, we've grown up. We got it then, but now we get something else, especially after the murder of George Floyd. There's something else that we're inching to tell, to release to society. And I think that's what folks are going to see here, and in Sacramento, and Scottsdale, and then in Santa Monica.
Well, it's unfortunate that in addition to George Floyd, we have to add Amir Locke's name to all of this. I mean,
and countless others, sadly.
Yeah, just and it just doesn't change.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't seem to change in one particular city, but that would be a different conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I very much enjoyed speaking with you, Derrell. It's been
likewise, Craig. Thank you.